In the shadows of America's frontier, some wounds never heal, and some secrets wait years to be revealed. They say death is final, that once the earth claims a body, that chapter is closed forever. But what happens when the dead reach out from beyond the grave? When a man who's already lost everything finds a child, a living, breathing piece of a puzzle he never knew existed, sitting beside his wife's headstone at dawn. What message could his beloved take to her grave, only to have it delivered years later? And how will this mysterious child change the destiny of a black rancher who thought his heart had been buried alongside his wife? Some stories from the American West were deliberately erased from our history books. This is one of them. Before I reveal this extraordinary story of loss, mystery, and unexpected redemption, I need you to do something crucial. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now. Why? Because the Black Rancher channel is dedicated to uncovering the buried stories of Black Americans who shaped the frontier. Stories of courage, heartbreak, and triumph that history tried to forget. If you stay until the end of this video, you'll discover not just how this mysterious child appeared at the grave, but how a single note changed everything this rancher thought he knew about love, family, and his own past. Your support means we can continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. So subscribe, share this video, and join me for At Dawn He Found a Child Beside the Grave and a Note from His Late Wife, only here on The Black Rancher. Montana Territory, September 1881. The first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of amber and gold as Solomon Hayes rode toward the small cemetery on the edge of his property. At 42, his body still carried the strength built from years of hard labor, though grief had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His dark skin contrasted with the silver beginning to pepper his close-cropped beard, and his broad shoulders were set with the rigid posture of a man who'd learned to carry his burdens in silence. It had been exactly 5 years since he'd buried Esther, his wife of 15 years. 5 years since influenza had swept through the region, taking her in just 3 days of fever and delirium. 5 years of tending the grave on the small hill overlooking the Hayes Ranch, 300 acres of hard-won Montana territory that they had transformed from wilderness into a working cattle operation. Solomon's Arabian gelding, Midnight, knew the path well. Every Sunday without fail, and on this particular day each year, they made the journey to the simple wooden cross marked with Esther's name. Today, Solomon carried wildflowers gathered from the creek bed, Esther's favorites, and a heaviness in his chest that never seemed to lighten, no matter how many years passed. As he approached the rise where the small family cemetery sat encircled by a wrought iron fence, something unusual caught his eye. A splash of color against the gray morning light. Solomon tensed, one hand moving instinctively to the rifle secured in his saddle holster. "Easy, Midnight," he murmured, slowing their approach. As they crested the hill, Solomon froze in the saddle. There, sitting beside Esther's grave, was a child. A small black child, no more than 6 or 7 years old, wrapped in a faded blue blanket and staring down at the grave marker. Solomon dismounted silently, his mind racing. The nearest town, Riversend, was 15 miles away. The closest black family he knew lived more than 30 miles south. How had a child, alone and on foot, come to be here? The child didn't look up as Solomon approached, seemingly transfixed by the weathered cross. It wasn't until Solomon's shadow fell across the grave that the child startled and turned. It was a girl. Her face was streaked with dirt, her dark eyes wide with exhaustion and weariness. Tight coils of black hair formed a halo around her small face. She clutched something in her hand, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "Hello there," Solomon said softly, crouching down to appear less intimidating. "I'm Solomon Hayes. This is my land, and this—" His voice caught. "This was my wife." The girl stared at him, unblinking. Then, wordlessly, she held out the paper. Solomon hesitated before taking it. The paper was worn at the folds, as if it had been opened and refolded many times. His name was written on the outside in a painfully familiar script. Esther's handwriting. His hands trembled as he unfolded the note, his eyes drinking in the words he'd never thought to see again. "My dearest Solomon, if you are reading this, then the child has found you, just as I prayed she would. Her name is Mercy, and she is 7 years old. She was born in secret during the time I spent caring for my sister in St. Louis, the year before the sickness took me. There is so much to explain, and such little space to do it. Know that I kept this secret not from shame, but from fear. Fear that the truth would bring danger to our door, to our home, to you. Mercy is your daughter, Solomon. Our daughter. The full story waits for you in the blue tin box beneath the floorboards under our bed, where I kept my most treasured possessions. I entrusted Mercy to my sister until she was old enough to make the journey, with help from friends along the railroad line who promised to see her safely to Montana. Love her as I have loved her from afar. Protect her as I no longer can. Forgive me, my love. Forever yours. Esther. Solomon's legs gave way, and he sank to the ground beside the grave. He read the note again, and then a third time, the words blurring through unshed tears. He looked up at the child, at Mercy, who watched him with Esther's eyes in a face that, now that he truly looked, held the echo of his own mother's features. "How did you get here?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hardly more than a whisper. "Miss Caroline put me on the train," Mercy said, her voice small but clear. "Then Mr. Porter met me in Helena and drove me close in his wagon. Said I had to walk the last part myself, follow the creek until I saw the graves on the hill. Said to wait by the cross with my mama's name." Solomon nodded slowly, recognizing the names of old friends from the Underground Railroad days. People he and Esther had trusted with their lives once. "Are you my pa?" Mercy asked suddenly. Solomon looked from her to the note, then to Esther's grave. The morning sun now illuminated the small cemetery, casting long shadows across the ground. In the distance, his ranch came to life, smoke rising from the chimney as Jeremiah, his ranch hand, started the morning fire. "Yes," he said finally, the word catching in his throat. "It seems I am." Mercy nodded solemnly, as if confirming something she'd already known. "Mama Vivian, that's what I called Mama's sister. She told me all about you, said you were strong and brave, said you built this whole place with your own hands." Solomon's mind whirled with questions. Why had Esther kept this child secret? What danger had she feared? And how would he, a man who'd lived alone with his grief for 5 years, care for a young daughter he'd never known existed? But as the sun rose higher and Mercy's small hand slipped trustingly into his, Solomon felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a spark of hope, fragile and unexpected, flickering to life in his chest. "Are you hungry?" he asked, rising to his feet and gathering the wildflowers he'd dropped. Mercy nodded, still holding his hand. "Let's go home then," Solomon said, "and I'll see about finding that blue tin box your mother mentioned." Together they placed the wildflowers on Esther's grave. Then Solomon lifted Mercy onto Midnight's back and mounted behind her. As they rode down the hill toward the ranch house, Solomon couldn't help looking back once more at the grave, at the final resting place of a woman who, even in death, had found a way to change his life completely. The ranch house stood solid against the Montana landscape, a 2-story structure built of pine logs and river stone that Solomon and Esther had constructed together over their first 5 years in the territory. What had begun as a 1-room cabin had expanded as their dreams and ambitions grew, though the house had never held the children they'd hoped would fill it, until now. Jeremiah Jackson, a former Buffalo soldier who'd come to work for Solomon 3 years ago, looked up in surprise as his employer rode into the yard with a child seated before him. "Mr. Hayes," he called, setting down the kindling he'd been gathering. "Jeremiah," Solomon acknowledged with a nod. "We have a visitor. This is Mercy." Confusion crossed the younger man's face as Solomon dismounted and then carefully lifted Mercy down from the horse. "She'll be staying with us," Solomon added, his tone making it clear that explanations would come later. "Yes, sir," Jeremiah replied, tipping his hat to Mercy. "Miss?" Mercy regarded him solemnly, still clutching her small bundle of possessions wrapped in the blue blanket. "Is breakfast on?" Solomon asked. "Yes, sir. Coffee's hot and biscuits are nearly ready." "Set another place then, and find Sarah when she comes to do the washing today. Tell her we'll need her help getting a room ready." Jeremiah nodded and headed inside, casting curious glances over his shoulder. Solomon led Mercy up the 3 wooden steps to the wide porch that wrapped around the front of the house. He paused at the door, suddenly aware of how unprepared he was for this moment. "This was your mother's home," he said softly. "She designed much of it herself. Said a house should be beautiful as well as practical." Mercy looked up at the sturdy structure with wide eyes. "It's bigger than Mama Vivian's house in St. Louis. It's bigger than it needs to be for just me," Solomon admitted. "But your mother always believed in building for the future. A future she somehow planned for, even knowing she wouldn't be part of it," he thought, the realization hitting him anew. Inside, the main room was simply but comfortably furnished. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a worn leather armchair positioned nearby. Bookshelves lined another wall. Esther had been a voracious reader, collecting volumes whenever possible. A solid oak table with 6 chairs stood in the dining area, and a doorway led to the kitchen where Jeremiah could be heard moving about. "Are you hungry?" Solomon asked again, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. Mercy nodded, her eyes taking in every detail of the house. "Let's eat first then," he decided, "and afterward, we'll look for that box your mother mentioned." Over a breakfast of biscuits, bacon, and honey, Mercy slowly began to relax. She ate ravenously, confirming Solomon's suspicion that her journey had been long and difficult. Jeremiah kept the conversation light, asking Mercy simple questions about what animals she liked and if she'd ever seen mountains before coming to Montana. After breakfast, Solomon led Mercy upstairs to the bedroom he had once shared with Esther. He hadn't slept there since her death, moving instead to a small room off the kitchen. The master bedroom remained largely unchanged, Esther's brush and mirror still on the dresser, her shawl draped over the rocking chair by the window. "Your mother's things," Solomon explained as Mercy looked around curiously. "I couldn't bring myself to pack them away?" He moved to the large bed with its handmade quilt and knelt beside it. The floorboards beneath were solid pine, carefully fitted together. Solomon ran his fingers along the seams until he found one that moved slightly under pressure. Using a pocket knife, he carefully pried up the board, revealing a small space beneath. There, just as Esther's note had promised, sat a blue tin box, the kind that once held Christmas cookies or special tea. Solomon lifted it out with reverent hands and carried it to the bed, where Mercy now perched on the edge, watching intently. "This was your mother's," he said, setting the box between them. "She kept her treasures in it." The hinged lid opened with a soft creak. Inside lay several items: a small leather journal, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a daguerreotype in a tarnished frame, and a folded document. Solomon's hands trembled as he lifted out the daguerreotype. It showed Esther, looking younger than when he'd last seen her, holding a newborn infant wrapped in a blanket. Her face glowed with both joy and sorrow. "That's you," he said softly to Mercy, who leaned forward to study the image. "And your mother." Next, he unfolded the document. It was a birth certificate, issued in St. Louis in 1874. It listed the child's name as Mercy Abigail Hayes, mother Esther Hayes, father Solomon Hayes. "She gave you my name," Solomon whispered, a lump forming in his throat. Finally, he opened the journal. Esther's familiar handwriting filled the pages, her private thoughts and explanations intended only for him, should the need ever arise. "I need to read this," he told Mercy gently. "It might help me understand why your mother kept you a secret from me." Mercy nodded, running her small fingers over the image of her mother. Solomon turned to the first entry, dated May 1874. "My dearest Solomon, I write these words with a heavy heart, though my arms are filled with the most perfect joy I could imagine. Our daughter, born 3 days ago, as the spring rain fell on St. Louis. You believe I am here caring for Vivian after her fall, and I was, until I discovered my own condition. I made the choice to stay longer, to hide this blessing from you, and the guilt of this deception weighs on me daily. Why would I keep such happiness from the man I love more than life itself? Because of what I learned during my time in the city. Information too dangerous to commit even to this private journal in full. What you must know is this. The Hayes Ranch has drawn unwanted attention. The success of a black-owned cattle operation has not gone unnoticed by those who believe such prosperity should be reserved for white men alone. During my visit, I encountered a man who spoke openly of plans to put us in our place. I fear that knowledge of a child, an heir to what we've built, would only increase their determination to see us driven out, or worse. So I make this impossible choice to keep our daughter with Vivian until the danger passes, or until she is old enough to travel safely to Montana should anything happen to me. Forgive me, Solomon. I pray daily that I can bring our mercy home to you myself, that this journal will never need to be read, that these precautions will prove unnecessary. With all my love, Esther Solomon closed the journal, his vision blurred with tears. The pieces were falling into place. Esther's extended stay in St. Louis, her subdued mood upon returning, the shadows that sometimes crossed her face when she thought he wasn't looking. "Your mother was trying to protect you," he told Mercy, his voice rough with emotion. "And me." Mercy nodded solemnly, as if she'd carried this knowledge all along. "Are you sorry she sent me here?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but direct. Solomon looked at this child, this piece of Esther and himself that had survived against all odds, and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness wash over him. "No," he said firmly, "I'm not sorry. I'm grateful. Your mother gave me the greatest gift possible. You." He hesitated, then carefully placed the items back in the tin box, except for the daguerreotype, which he handed to Mercy. "This belongs with you now, so you can always see your mother's face." Mercy took the picture carefully, tracing the outline of Esther's face with one small finger. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Jeremiah stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "Sarah's here, Mr. Hayes, and there's a rider coming up the road." "Looks like Sheriff Davis." Solomon nodded, his mind racing. Why would the sheriff be paying a morning call? Was it possible that someone had seen Mercy arrive, that the dangers Esther had feared were still present? "Thank you, Jeremiah. Tell Sarah I need her help getting a room ready for Mercy, and I'll be down to meet the sheriff directly." As Jeremiah retreated, Solomon turned to Mercy. "I need to speak with our visitor." "This is Sarah," he said as a middle-aged black woman appeared in the doorway. "She helps around the house twice a week. She'll get you settled while I'm busy." Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of the child, but years of discretion kept her from asking the obvious questions. "Miss Mercy," she said instead with a warm smile, "how about we find you a nice room and maybe some fresh clothes? You look like you've had quite a journey." Mercy looked to Solomon for reassurance. "It's all right," he told her. "Sarah was your mother's friend. You can trust her." As Sarah led Mercy away, Solomon tucked Esther's journal inside his shirt. Whatever danger had concerned Esther enough to separate him from his child might still exist, and he intended to be prepared for it. If you're captivated by Solomon's discovery and the mystery of why Esther kept their daughter hidden, you're experiencing just a taste of the untold stories from America's past that we bring to light here on The Black Rancher. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our upcoming episodes. Our stories reveal the truth about Black Americans who shaped the frontier against incredible odds. Now let's return to Montana Territory 1881, as Sheriff Davis arrives at the Hayes Ranch with news that could change everything for Solomon and his newly discovered daughter. Sheriff Thomas Davis was a fair man by most accounts, one of the few local officials who treated Solomon with the same respect he afforded any successful rancher in the county. His horse stood sweating in the yard, evidence of a hard ride from town. "Sheriff," Solomon greeted him from the porch, careful to betray nothing of the tumultuous emotions still coursing through him. "What brings you out this way so early?" Davis removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. "Morning, Hayes. Sorry to disturb you, especially today." The sheriff was one of the few who remembered the significance of this date for Solomon. "No disturbance," Solomon replied evenly. "Coffee's still hot if you're interested." "Much obliged." Inside, Solomon poured 2 cups, while Davis settled at the table, placing his hat beside him. "I'll get straight to it, Hayes," the sheriff said after taking a long sip. "There's been talk in town. The Cattlemen's Association held a meeting yesterday." Solomon's jaw tightened. The Cattlemen's Association had never invited him to join, despite the Hayes Ranch being one of the more successful operations in the county. What kind of talk? Water rights mainly. Driscoll's making noise about the creek that runs through your property. Says with the dry summer we've had, he needs guaranteed access for his herd. James Driscoll owned the largest ranch in the county, the Double D, with over 2,000 acres bordering Solomon's land to the north. He'd made no secret of his desire to expand southward, directly into Hayes territory. "The creek's on my land," Solomon said carefully, "deeded and registered with the territorial office. But Driscoll knows I've never denied water to any rancher in need." Davis nodded. "That's what I told them. But Driscoll's got 3 new investors from back east, men with money and influence. They're talking about consolidating resources for efficiency." Solomon understood the implication. These weren't just business discussions. This was about removing the anomaly of a black-owned ranch from what they saw as their rightful domain. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff." Davis leaned forward. "There's more, Hayes. Driscoll hired new hands last month. Rough men, including 2 I recognize from wanted posters in Wyoming. Nothing I can act on yet, but I'd keep my guard up if I were you." Solomon thought of Esther's journal, of her fears from 7 years ago, and felt a chill despite the warm kitchen. "Thank you, Thomas," he said, using the sheriff's first name, something he rarely did. "I'll be careful." Davis hesitated, then added, "One more thing. There was a woman asking questions in town yesterday. Black woman from St. Louis, according to Mabel at the hotel. Said she was looking for a child." Solomon's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "Did she give a name?" "Vivian, I believe. Mabel said she seemed desperate, like she'd been searching a while." Relief flooded Solomon. Vivian, Esther's sister, Mercy's Mama Vivian. "If you see her again," Solomon said carefully, "you might let her know she's welcome at the Hayes Ranch." Davis's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't ask the obvious question. Instead, he drained his cup and stood. "I should get back. Just wanted you to know what's brewing. Whatever Driscoll's planning, it might come sooner rather than later." Solomon walked the sheriff out. As Davis mounted his horse, he paused. "Hayes," he said quietly, "if you need help, you send word. There are still men in this county who believe in the law." With that, he rode off, leaving Solomon standing in the yard, considering threats both old and new. When he returned inside, Sarah was at the stove, preparing lunch. "The child's resting," she said without preamble. "Exhausted, poor lamb. I put her in the small bedroom next to yours. Hope that's suitable." "Thank you, Sarah." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, fixing Solomon with a direct gaze. "That child has your eyes and Miss Esther's chin. And she's carrying a daguerreotype of Miss Esther, holding her as a baby." It wasn't a question, but Solomon answered anyway. "She's my daughter, Esther's and mine, born while Esther was in St. Louis 7 years ago." Sarah absorbed this without visible surprise. "Miss Esther had her reasons, I expect." "She did." "Well then," Sarah said, turning back to her cooking, "about time this house had a child in it. Miss Esther would have wanted that." The simplicity of her acceptance was a balm to Solomon's still raw emotions. "Sheriff bring trouble?" Sarah asked, changing the subject. "Warnings of trouble coming," Solomon corrected. "Driscoll and his associates have plans for my land, it seems." Sarah's lips thinned. "That man's been coveting this place since you and Miss Esther built it up proper. Never did sit right with him seeing black folks succeed." "No," Solomon agreed grimly. "It didn't." Before they could continue, Jeremiah burst through the door, his usual composure shattered. "Riders coming," he reported breathlessly. 6 men. Driscoll's in front." Solomon moved to the window. Sure enough, a group of mounted men was approaching from the north road, dust rising behind them. "Sarah," he said calmly, "please go upstairs and stay with Mercy. Keep her quiet and out of sight." Sarah nodded grimly and hurried upstairs. "Jeremiah, get the shotgun from my office." Not to threaten, just to have ready. As Jeremiah retrieved the weapon, Solomon stepped onto the porch, presenting a calm, unruffled facade as the riders entered his yard. James Driscoll was a big man, both in stature and presence. His expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance spoke of his wealth, but the cold eyes beneath his Stetson revealed his true nature. "Hayes," he called, not bothering to dismount. "Fine morning for a ride." "Driscoll," Solomon acknowledged. "What brings you and your men to the Hayes ranch?" Driscoll gestured expansively. "Just checking on my neighbors after such a dry summer, making sure everyone's managing." "We're managing fine," Solomon replied evenly. "Glad to hear it," Driscoll smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Some smaller operations aren't faring so well. Been thinking it might be time for some consolidation in the valley." "My operation isn't for sale, if that's what you're suggesting." Driscoll's smile tightened. "Everything's for sale at the right price, Hayes, or under the right circumstances." The threat was thinly veiled. Behind Driscoll, his men shifted in their saddles, hands resting too casually near their sidearms. "I appreciate your concern," Solomon said, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "But the Hayes Ranch will remain the Hayes Ranch." Driscoll's false geniality slipped. "You're being short-sighted. My associates and I are planning major improvements to this valley. New irrigation systems, expanded herds, connections to the railroad. Progress is coming, Hayes. Don't get left behind." "Sounds like progress for some at the expense of others," Solomon observed. A flash of irritation crossed Driscoll's face. "I'd reconsider your position if I were you. Land's only valuable when you can hold on to it." Before Solomon could respond, the door opened behind him. Jeremiah stepped out, shotgun held casually but visibly at his side. "Mr. Hayes," he said calmly, "lunch is ready whenever you'd like it." The message to Driscoll and his men was clear. Solomon wasn't alone. Driscoll's eyes narrowed as he assessed Jeremiah, recognizing another former soldier when he saw one. "Well," he said finally, gathering his reins, "we won't keep you from your meal. Think about what I said, Hayes. There'll be changes coming to this valley, with or without your cooperation." With that, he wheeled his horse around. As his men followed suit, one of them, a hard-faced man with a scar along his jaw, lingered, his cold gaze sweeping the house and outbuildings with calculating precision. Solomon stood on the porch until the riders disappeared over the ridge, then let out a long breath. "They'll be back," Jeremiah said quietly. "Yes," Solomon agreed, "but next time we'll be better prepared." Inside, they found Sarah descending the stairs, her expression troubled. "The child heard everything," she reported. "She's scared but trying not to show it." Solomon nodded and headed upstairs, finding Mercy sitting on the edge of her bed, the daguerreotype clutched tightly in her hands. "Are those bad men going to take our home?" she asked directly, her voice small but steady. The words, "our home," struck Solomon powerfully. Not your home, but our home. In just hours, this child had claimed her place in his life and on this land. "No," he said firmly, sitting beside her. "This land belongs to the Hayes family. It always will. Mama Vivian said Mama was afraid of bad men. That's why I had to stay hidden." Solomon nodded slowly. "Your mother was very brave and very smart. She wanted to keep you safe." "But now I'm here," Mercy said, a hint of worry creeping into her voice. Solomon placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Now you're here," he agreed, "and we'll face whatever comes together. That's what family does." Mercy considered this, then asked, "Did you love my mama?" "With all my heart," Solomon answered without hesitation. "She was the strongest, kindest woman I've ever known. Mama Vivian said I look like her." "You do," Solomon smiled. "Same determined chin. Same way of looking straight at a person when you speak." Mercy nodded, satisfied with this connection to the mother she'd never truly known. "Can I stay here forever?" she asked suddenly. Solomon felt something shift and settle in his chest, the grief that had been his constant companion for 5 years, making room for something new, something like hope. "Yes," he said firmly, "this is your home now, and I'm going to do everything in my power to keep it safe for you." As Mercy's small hand found his, Solomon knew with absolute certainty that his life had changed irrevocably. The land that he and Esther had worked so hard to build was no longer just a legacy of their past. It was now the foundation for a future he'd never dared imagine. 3 days after Mercy's appearance, Solomon was mending fence in the north pasture when Jeremiah rode up at a gallop. "Rider coming," he reported. "Black woman traveling alone, coming from the direction of town." Solomon straightened immediately. "Vivian," he said, more to himself than to Jeremiah, "take over here. I'll head back to the house." By the time he reached the ranch yard, the rider was just approaching, a slender woman on a rented horse, her dark skin contrasting with the dusty gray traveling dress she wore. She pulled up short at the sight of Solomon, her expression a mixture of uncertainty and determination. "Mr. Hayes," she called, remaining mounted. "Mrs. Vivian Walker, I presume," Solomon replied, approaching slowly. "Esther's sister." Relief flooded her features. "You know who I am." "Then you've met Mercy?" Solomon nodded. "She arrived 3 days ago. She's safe." Vivian's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank God." When she disappeared from the way station in Helena, she broke off, clearly overwhelmed. "Please," Solomon said, stepping forward to help her dismount. "Come inside. Mercy will be overjoyed to see you." As if summoned by her name, the door to the house flew open, and Mercy raced across the yard. "Mama Vivian!" she cried, flinging herself into the woman's arms as soon as her feet touched the ground. "Mercy, child!" Vivian exclaimed, dropping to her knees to embrace the girl. "You scared 10 years off my life, running off from Mr. Porter like that." "I didn't run off," Mercy protested. "He told me where to go, said to follow the creek to the graves on the hill." Vivian pulled back, her expression troubled. "Porter told you to go alone. That wasn't the plan." "He was supposed to bring you directly to the ranch." Solomon frowned. "Seems there's been some confusion. Let's sort it out inside." In the kitchen, Sarah provided coffee and fresh bread while Vivian explained the situation. "After your last letter," she said to Solomon, mentioning the 5th anniversary of Esther's passing, "I knew it was time. Esther made me promise to wait until Mercy was 7 and strong enough to make the journey." Solomon's confusion must have shown on his face, because Vivian stopped abruptly. "My letter?" he asked. "I never wrote to you. I didn't even know of your existence until Mercy arrived with Esther's note." A tense silence fell over the kitchen. "But I received a letter," Vivian insisted, "6 weeks ago, signed with your name, saying it was time for Mercy to come to Montana, that you were ready to meet your daughter." Solomon shook his head slowly. "I didn't send that letter." Vivian's hand trembled as she set down her coffee cup. Then who did? The implication hung heavily in the air. Someone had orchestrated Mercy's journey, someone who knew about her existence and her connection to Solomon. "Did you bring the letter?" Solomon asked. Vivian nodded and reached into her handbag, extracting a folded paper. Solomon read it quickly, his frown deepening. "This isn't my handwriting," he confirmed, though someone went to considerable trouble to make it appear so. "But who would know about Mercy?" Sarah asked, voicing what they were all thinking. "Miss Esther kept that secret close." "Not close enough, it seems," Solomon said grimly. Vivian looked stricken. "I've put her in danger. I should never have sent her ahead with Porter." "You couldn't have known," Solomon assured her, "and Mercy is here now, safe." "For how long?" Vivian challenged. "If someone manipulated me into sending her here, they had a reason." Solomon's mind raced, piecing together the timing. The forged letter sent to Vivian 6 weeks ago. Driscoll's new investors arriving around the same time. The increased pressure on his land. "They're using her," he realized aloud. "Using my daughter to pressure me." "Pressure you into what?" Vivian asked. "Selling my ranch, giving up the land Esther and I built together." Mercy, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "The bad men who came yesterday?" Solomon nodded grimly. "Most likely." Vivian looked alarmed. "What bad men?" Quickly, Solomon explained about Driscoll's visit and the thinly veiled threats. As he spoke, Vivian's expression changed from confusion to determination. "Esther wrote to me about this man," she said. "Years ago, when she first suspected someone was targeting your ranch, she was convinced he'd stop at nothing to take what you'd built." "That's why she kept Mercy a secret," Solomon concluded. "She feared Driscoll would use our child against us." And now he has found a way to do exactly that, Vivian said grimly. Solomon rose and paced the kitchen, thinking rapidly. But how did Driscoll learn about Mercy after all these years? Who could have told him? A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only when Jeremiah appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Mr. Hayes," he said urgently, "riders coming from town, Sheriff Davis and 3 others." Solomon looked at Vivian. "Stay with Mercy. Sarah, show Mrs. Walker to the spare bedroom. She'll be staying with us." Outside, Solomon watched as the sheriff and his companions approached. One of them was Porter, the man who had supposedly been entrusted with Mercy's final leg of journey to the Hayes ranch. "Sheriff," Solomon greeted them, his expression neutral. "What brings you back so soon?" Davis dismounted, looking troubled. "Hayes, this is Willis Porter. Says he was hired to transport a child to your ranch, but the child went missing on the way. He's been searching for 3 days. Porter, a thin man with nervous eyes, nodded vigorously. "That's right, Mr. Hayes. Little girl, about 7, was supposed to deliver her direct to you, but she wandered off when we stopped to water the horses. Been worried sick." Solomon studied the man carefully, noting the sweat on his brow despite the cool autumn air. "Interesting," he said evenly. "Since the child in question is currently inside my house, having arrived safely on her own 3 days ago. She claims you instructed her to walk the final distance alone." Porter's face paled. "That's not, I never—" "And even more interesting," Solomon continued, "is that her aunt has just arrived from St. Louis, concerned because you failed to send word that Mercy had been delivered safely as you promised to do." Sheriff Davis turned to Porter, his expression hardening. "You told me the child was in your care for less than a day." Porter's eyes darted between the men. "There's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Solomon cut in. "You were paid to deliver my daughter safely to my door. Instead, you abandoned a 7-year-old child miles from her destination. The only question is why." Porter's composure cracked. "I was just following instructions. He paid extra, said the girl needed to arrive alone, that it was important." "Who paid you?" Davis demanded. Porter's gaze dropped. "Can't say. Man would kill me. And I might do worse if anything had happened to my daughter," Solomon said, his voice deadly quiet. Davis placed a restraining hand on Solomon's arm. "Let me handle this, Hayes." To Porter, he said, "You're coming back to town with me. We'll continue this conversation in a cell where you might feel more inclined to share names." As the sheriff and his deputies prepared to leave with a now handcuffed Porter, Davis pulled Solomon aside. "There's something bigger happening here, Hayes. Driscoll's investors were asking about you in town yesterday, specifically about your family situation, whether you had any children." Solomon's jaw tightened. "Sheriff, I need you to send telegrams to the Territorial Land Office and to my bank in Helena. I want confirmation that all my paperwork is in order. Deed, water rights, everything." Davis nodded grimly. "You think they're moving against you legally?" "I think they're moving against me any way they can, and I need to be prepared." After the sheriff and his party departed, Solomon returned to the house to find Vivian, Mercy, and Sarah waiting anxiously in the kitchen. "Porter's been arrested," he informed them. "He admitted someone paid him to ensure Mercy arrived here alone." "But why?" Sarah asked. "What purpose would that serve?" "To make her vulnerable," Vivian suggested. "To give them leverage over you, Solomon." Solomon nodded slowly. "Driscoll wants my land. Has for years. But he's always lacked a compelling way to force me out. And now he believes he has one," Vivian concluded. "Yes," Solomon agreed grimly. "A child traveling alone, arriving mysteriously at a bachelor's ranch, it creates questions, suspicions. And if those suspicions were to reach certain ears in the territorial government, they could challenge your custody," Vivian finished, "use it as a pretext to seize the property. Especially if they've already begun manipulating land records or banking documents," Solomon added, "creating a paper trail to suggest financial problems or ownership disputes." Mercy, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Are they going to take me away?" The directness of the question pierced Solomon's heart. He knelt before his daughter, looking her in the eye. "No," he said firmly. "You are my daughter. This is your home. and I will not let anyone take you or this land away from us." Mercy studied his face, then nodded solemnly. "Mama's note said you would protect me, and I will," Solomon promised. "But first, we need to understand exactly what we're facing." He turned to Vivian. "I need to know everything. Who knew about Mercy? Who might have had access to Esther's letters? Who could have connected the child to me after all these years?" Vivian nodded grimly. "I'll tell you everything I know, and then we'll figure out how to fight back." As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, Solomon Hayes made a silent vow to his late wife. The family she had protected at such personal cost would not be torn apart. Not by James Driscoll, not by corrupt officials, not by anyone. The Hayes Ranch would remain in Hayes' hands for Mercy and for all the generations that might follow. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost silvering the grass and the distant mountains sharp against the sky. Solomon had spent much of the night reading Esther's journal, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered during her time in St. Louis. What emerged was a disturbing picture of a coordinated effort, not just by Driscoll but by a network of powerful men determined to reclaim land that had fallen into the hands of former slaves during the chaotic period following the Civil War. Esther had documented meetings, overheard conversations, and patterns of harassment against black landowners across multiple territories. The Hayes Ranch was particularly significant because of its prime location and water access, and because Solomon had secured proper legal documentation for every aspect of his ownership, making it difficult to challenge through normal channels. Solomon closed the journal as the first light crept through his window. Esther had been right to be cautious, and now, years later, her warnings had proven prescient. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, where he found Vivian already awake, making coffee in the kitchen. "Couldn't sleep," she explained, pouring him a cup. "Too much weighing on my mind." Solomon nodded his thanks. "I've been reading Esther's journal. She knew more than she ever told me." "My sister was a careful woman," Vivian said softly. "She understood the world we live in better than most." Before Solomon could respond, Jeremiah appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Riders coming," he reported, "but not from the north this time, Eastern Road." Solomon moved to the window. A group of 6 men approached, led by a figure he recognized with a jolt, Judge William Hargrove, the territorial circuit judge whose jurisdiction included Riversend County. "It's the judge," Solomon said grimly, "with an official party." Vivian joined him at the window. "Is that good or bad?" "Depends on why he's here," Solomon replied. "Hargrove has always been fair in his dealings with me, but if Driscoll has manipulated territorial documents..." He turned to Jeremiah. "Wake Mercy and Sarah, everyone dressed and presentable, and bring me the deed box from my office, the iron one with the lock." As Jeremiah hurried to comply, Solomon straightened his shoulders. "Vivian, stay close to Mercy. Answer any questions honestly, but follow my lead." Minutes later, Solomon stood on his porch as Judge Hargrove and his party dismounted in the yard. Besides the judge, the group included 2 territorial marshals, a clerk carrying a portfolio of documents, and to Solomon's surprise, Sheriff Davis. "Judge Hargrove," Solomon greeted him with a respectful nod. "This is an unexpected honor." Hargrove was in his 60s, with a distinguished bearing and shrewd eyes that missed little. "Mr. Hayes," he replied, "I apologize for the early hour, but matters have arisen that require immediate attention." "Of course," Solomon said evenly. "Please come inside. Coffee's hot." In the main room, introductions were made as Sarah served coffee. Mercy stayed close to Vivian's side, regarding the visitors with solemn curiosity. Judge Hargrove accepted his cup with thanks, then got directly to business. "Mr. Hayes, I've received some concerning reports regarding a child allegedly brought to your property under questionable circumstances." "You're referring to my daughter," Solomon said calmly, placing a subtle emphasis on the relationship. Hargrove's eyebrows rose. "Your daughter? My understanding was that you were unmarried and childless." "Widowed," Solomon corrected. "My wife Esther died 5 years ago. Our daughter was born during Esther's extended visit to St. Louis, where she stayed with her sister, Mrs. Walker." He gestured to Vivian. The judge looked between Solomon and Vivian, clearly reassessing the situation. I see. And the child has been in your care since birth? In Mrs. Walker's care, Solomon explained, for reasons documented in my late wife's journal and correspondence. Mercy was brought to Montana only recently, when she was deemed old enough to travel safely. The clerk leaned over to whisper something to the judge, who frowned. Mr. Hayes, I've also received information suggesting irregularities in your land ownership documents, specifically questions about water rights and boundary descriptions that might invalidate your claim to portions of this property. Solomon nodded, unsurprised. I anticipated such claims might arise. That's why I've maintained meticulous records. He gestured to Jeremiah, who brought forward the iron deed box. Solomon unlocked it and removed a sheaf of carefully preserved documents. My original deed, he said, handing it to the judge, registered with the Territorial Land Office in 1869. Water rights documentation, boundary surveys, tax receipts for every year since purchase, and banking records showing all payments made in full. As the judge and his clerk examined the papers, Sheriff Davis stepped forward. Judge, I should mention that Willis Porter is currently in my jail. He's admitted to being paid to abandon the child short of her destination, though he's still refusing to name who hired him. Hargrove looked up sharply. Paid to abandon a child? That's a serious criminal matter. Yes, sir, Davis agreed, and I believe it connects to certain parties who have been attempting to pressure Mr. Hayes into selling his property. James Driscoll, Solomon said quietly. And his Eastern investors. The judge's expression darkened. Serious accusations, Mr. Hayes. Based on documented evidence, Solomon replied, retrieving Esther's journal from his shirt. My late wife recorded information about efforts to undermine black landowners throughout this territory, information she gathered during her time in St. Louis, which led her to keep our daughter's existence secret for her protection. He handed the journal to Hargrove, who skimmed several pages, his frown deepening. This is disturbing, he said finally, but circumstantial at best. Perhaps, Solomon agreed, but considered alongside Porter's confession and the sudden appearance of challenges to my land rights immediately after my daughter's arrival, it suggests a coordinated effort. Mercy, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. Mama left a note with me, she said, her clear voice drawing all eyes. For my pa. It explained everything. Solomon looked at his daughter with pride. The note is in the deed box as well, Your Honor, along with Mercy's birth certificate listing me as her father. As the judge examined these additional documents, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Jeremiah moved to the window. Driscoll, he reported grimly. With a larger party than before? Solomon nodded, unsurprised. It appears the final player has arrived, Your Honor, right on cue. Hargrove rose and moved to the window, watching as Driscoll and at least 10 riders entered the yard. This is most irregular, the judge muttered. Sheriff, perhaps you should— With respect, Your Honor, Solomon interrupted. I believe we should hear what Mr. Driscoll has to say. His timing is illuminating. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but I will not tolerate any disturbance of the peace. Solomon stepped onto the porch, flanked by the judge, the sheriff, and the 2 marshals. Driscoll pulled up short at the sight of the official party, momentary confusion crossing his face before he recovered his composure. Judge Hargrove, he called, tipping his hat. Didn't expect to find you here. I was just paying a neighborly visit to Hayes. With 10 armed men? The sheriff observed dryly. Driscoll waved a dismissive hand. Dangerous country. Can't be too careful. Indeed, Judge Hargrove said coolly. Mr. Driscoll, your neighborly visit coincides with some troubling allegations regarding attempts to undermine Mr. Hayes's legal rights to this property. Driscoll's smile tightened. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Your Honor. I'm simply here to discuss a business proposition with Hayes. The same proposition you mentioned during your previous visit, Solomon asked. When you suggested that land is only valuable when you can hold on to it. The judge's eyebrows rose. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Driscoll. A simple observation, Driscoll countered, Business can be unpredictable. As can the law, Judge Hargrove replied, his tone hardening. Sheriff Davis tells me one of your associates, Willis Porter, has been arrested for endangering a child, specifically Mr. Hayes' daughter. For the first time, Driscoll's confidence faltered. Porter's no associate of mine, and I wasn't aware Hayes had any children. A convenient ignorance, Solomon said, given that someone sent a forged letter in my name to bring my daughter here, precisely when you and your investors began pushing for my land. Driscoll's face flushed with anger. You can't prove any connection. Perhaps not yet, the judge interrupted, but I find the timing highly suspect, particularly in light of documents recently submitted to my court questioning Mr. Hayes' land rights, documents that I now have reason to believe may have been fraudulently prepared. One of Driscoll's men shifted nervously in his saddle, exchanging glances with another rider. The judge noticed. Mr. Driscoll, I suggest you and your men return to your own property. There will be a formal investigation into these matters, and I advise you to cooperate fully. For a moment, tension crackled in the air as Driscoll weighed his options. His gaze moved from the judge to the marshals, then to Solomon, standing tall and unintimidated on his own porch. Finally, Driscoll gathered his reins. This isn't over, Hayes. On that point, we agree, Solomon replied evenly, but how it ends may surprise you. As Driscoll and his men rode away, Judge Hargrove turned to Solomon. You've made a powerful enemy, Mr. Hayes. He's always been my enemy, Your Honor, Solomon answered. The difference now is that his methods have been exposed. Back inside, the judge completed his review of Solomon's documents, finding everything in order. As he prepared to leave, he addressed Solomon directly. I'll open a formal inquiry into Driscoll's actions and the attempted manipulation of land records. Sheriff Davis will continue investigating Porter's involvement. In the meantime, your rights to this property remain secure, and your custody of your daughter is not in question. Solomon nodded gratefully. Thank you, Your Honor. As the official party mounted up, Hargrove added, One more thing, Hayes. I'd consider filing formal adoption papers for the child. Given the unusual circumstances of her arrival in your life, it would provide additional legal protection. I'll do that, Solomon agreed. Today, if possible. After the judge and his party departed, Solomon returned to the porch, where Mercy waited with Vivian and Sarah. Is it over? Mercy asked, her small face serious. Solomon lifted her into his arms. The beginning is over, he said thoughtfully. Driscoll's plan has been exposed and the judge is on our side. But there may be more challenges ahead. Are you scared? Mercy asked directly. Solomon considered the question, then shook his head. No. Your mother faced her fears to protect you. Now it's my turn to be brave. Vivian stepped forward. I should return to St. Louis. Gather more evidence about who might have known about Mercy. There might be records in Esther's things that could help strengthen your case against Driscoll. Solomon nodded. That would be valuable. But you're welcome to stay longer if you wish. Get to know your niece's new home. Vivian smiled. I'd like that, and I think Esther would want me to see the life she built with you, the legacy she protected for Mercy. As the morning sun climbed higher, warming the frost-covered landscape, Solomon stood on his porch with his daughter in his arms and his late wife's sister at his side. The Hayes Ranch spread before them, the barn, the corrals, the grazing cattle, and beyond them, the mountains that had witnessed their struggles and triumphs. This land, hard-won and beloved, would remain in Hayes' hands. The family Esther had sacrificed to protect would endure. And the legacy she had preserved through her courage and foresight would continue to grow, nurtured by the love she had planted in all their hearts. Solomon looked down at Mercy, seeing Esther's determination in her eyes, and felt a peace he hadn't known in 5 long years. Welcome home, Mercy Hayes, he said softly. Welcome home. If this story moved you, if Solomon and Mercy's journey touched your heart, then you understand why the Black Rancher exists. We're here to uncover the erased histories of Black Americans who shaped the West with courage, dignity, and love. The stories of Black ranchers, cowboys, homesteaders, and pioneers have been systematically removed from our shared American narrative. By subscribing to this channel, you help ensure that these powerful truths continue to be told. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and share this video with anyone who appreciates authentic American history. Your comments below help us know which stories resonate most deeply with you and what untold narratives you'd like to see featured next. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the hidden corners of America's past. Until next time, this is The Black Rancher, because our history deserves to be remembered.